Salvatore Conti had planned this conversation the way he planned everything, precisely, without feeling. The marriage certificate was signed. The debt was, on paper, settled. All that remained was to walk into that bedroom and tell his new wife exactly what this marriage would and would not be. He opened the door without knocking. Clara Bellweather stood by the window in a plain white robe, her back to him, her arms wrapped around herself as though she were cold in a room that wasn't. She didn't turn when she heard him. "You don't have to pretend this is a wedding," she said quietly. "I already know what it is." "I came to be clear about terms," Salvatore said. "This marriage exists on paper. You'll appear publicly as my wife when it's required. Beyond that, I have no expectation of anything from you that you don't choose to give." Clara turned to face him then, and the robe slipped from one shoulder. That was when he saw it. A cluster of pale, silvered, burn scars climbing from her collarbone across her shoulder blade and down the back of her arm, old and unmistakable, the mark of skin that had been badly burned in more than one place. He stopped talking. "What is this?" Clara pulled the robe back into place, her hands steady even though her voice wasn't. "Ask Dominic Russo," she said. "Ask him why the fire report he filed never once mentioned that someone went back inside that warehouse after the flames started. I was 17. I went in after my father. I have the scars to prove it. And no one in your family ever asked why the daughter of the man who supposedly fled a fire clean came home burned." Salvatore said nothing for a long moment. He had spent 11 years certain of exactly one story, and the woman standing in front of him had just told him a detail that story had never accounted for. "I'll look into it," he said finally, and left before either of them could say anything else. He didn't sleep that night. 2 days earlier he hadn't known Clara Bellweather's name, at all beyond a ledger entry that renewed itself every quarter like an old wound that never fully closed. 2 days earlier. The bell over the door of Bellweather Blooms had rung at 9:02 in the morning, and 4 men in dark suits had filled the doorway of the only thing Clara had left of the life her family used to have. She'd unlocked that door at 5:45 every morning for 6 years, since she was 22, and her father's name had gone from respected to ruined overnight. The shop was small, wedged between a shuttered bakery and a laundromat that smelled permanently of bleach, but it was hers, and on cold mornings the smell of eucalyptus and cut stems was the only thing that made the world feel manageable. Her younger brother Tommy did his homework at the back counter every afternoon, because Clara couldn't afford to pay anyone to watch him and wouldn't have wanted to anyway. Their mother had died when Tommy was 6. Their father had died 3 years ago, in a rented room above a hardware store, still insisting to anyone who'd listen that he hadn't set the fire everyone blamed him for. Nobody had listened. The Bellweather name had been poison in Havenport for over a decade, ever since a warehouse fire destroyed a shipment belonging to the Conti family and cost old Massimo Conti his life 3 weeks later. In a heart attack standing in wreckage, everyone agreed was arson. Nobody agreed on whether it was carelessness or design. Nobody much cared, because either way, a debt was owed, and in Havenport, debts to the Conti family were never forgotten. Clara had built the shop back up from nothing, one careful decision at a time. When a bride once came in sobbing because her sister had ordered the wrong flowers for a funeral the same week as the wedding, Clara had spent an entire night rebuilding both orders from a single delivery, color-coding buckets so nothing crossed, refusing payment for the extra hours because grief and joy shouldn't have to compete for the same roses. An elderly widower named Mr. Ashford came in every Friday for a single carnation and never explained why. And Clara never asked either. She simply always had one ready before he reached the counter. People in Havenport didn't talk about Clara Bellweather kindly very often, not with her father's name still hanging over the family, but the ones who actually knew her kept coming back anyway, quietly, the way people return to something reliable, without needing to say so out loud. Once a quarter, a quiet, carefully dressed man named Dominic Russo came to collect the payment. Money that was supposed to be settling a debt Clara had never agreed to, and never understood, inherited the way some people inherit eye color. He always counted the bills twice, said very little, and never once looked directly at the shop's back wall, where Clara had hung the only photograph she owned of her father, standing proudly in front of a warehouse that no longer existed. That Tuesday, Russo trailed half a step behind Salvatore Conti, clipboard in hand, his eyes sliding briefly to that photograph before he caught himself. Salvatore didn't look like a man who needed a warehouse full of soldiers to be dangerous. He looked like winter standing still. "Miss Bellweather, we have business to discuss," he told her without raising his voice. Exactly what he intended. The debt, the fire, his father's death, 11 years of payments that had never come close to settling it, would be closed permanently, in exchange for her hand in marriage, not out of affection, a public correction. The daughter of the man who'd ruined his family, wearing the Conti name, answering to him for the rest of her life. And if I say no, then the debt remains open. His eyes moved briefly to Tommy, frozen in the back doorway with a textbook still open in his hands. And debts eventually come due, one way or another. Clara understood, standing in her own flower shop with her little brother watching, that there had never really been a choice at all. Beside Salvatore, Russo cleared his throat and studied his clipboard with unusual intensity. "I'll need 3 days. You have 2. She married him on a grey Saturday morning in a private chapel with 11 witnesses, none of whom smiled. She wore a dress that had belonged to her mother, taken in twice because her mother had been smaller than her. And when the officiant asked if she took this man, Clara said yes in a voice that didn't shake, because she'd promised herself it wouldn't. Salvatore didn't look at her once during the ceremony. He looked at a point somewhere past her shoulder, as though the actual woman standing in front of him were beside the point entirely. Russo stood near the back, close enough that Clara noticed him fidgeting with his cufflinks through the entire ceremony, though she had no reason yet to wonder why. Afterward, a car took her to the Conti estate, grey stone behind iron gates that made her father's old warehouse look like a shed. Salvatore's aunt, a sharp-featured woman named Livia Moretti, who ran the household like a fortress, met them at the door with an expression that suggested she'd smelled something unpleasant. "So this is her," Livia said, looking Clara over the way someone inspects a delivery they intend to refuse. "Who killed my brother?" "Livia," Salvatore said without heat. "The Conti name deserves better than this." "I'll try not to embarrass the silverware," Clara said, and Livia's mouth thinned into a line before she turned on her heel, leaving Clara standing in a marble foyer bigger than her entire flower shop, a few hours before Salvatore walked into her room that first night and left it again, unsettled, with a set of scars and an accusation he couldn't stop turning over. He gave Enzo Marchetti the fire report the next morning and asked him to pull the original file. What came back told him nothing new. The same conclusion the household had repeated for 11 years. No mention anywhere of injuries. No mention of anyone entering the building after the alarm. Either the report had been careless or someone had made sure it stayed that way. "Keep it open," Salvatore told him, quietly. That first week, Clara learned the estate ran on a rhythm she'd never encountered. Disciplined, silent, watchful. She also learned that Dominic Russo held an unusual position within it. Not quite family, not quite staff. A man who managed the household's older financial records and had personally overseen the Bellweather collections file for over a decade. When she mentioned, in passing, that she'd like to see the estate's old records archive, Russo appeared in her doorway within the hour, pleasant and apologetic. "It's mostly water-damaged," he told her, standing just inside the doorframe, as though he didn't quite trust himself to come further in. "Old shipping logs, tax filings, nothing worth your time. I'd hate for you to spend an afternoon breathing mold for nothing." He smiled, and it didn't quite reach his eyes. "The greenhouse would suit you far better." "I might still take a look sometime," Clara said, mostly to see what he'd do. "Of course, whenever you like." He left before she could say anything else, and she noticed, without quite understanding why it mattered yet, that his hands had been in his pockets the entire conversation, and that he'd said, "Whenever you like." The way people say things they very much hope will never happen. The greenhouse on the eastern edge of the property had been locked for years, its glass panes clouded with dust, its raised beds gone to weeds. Livia refused Clara the key. She found the groundskeeper instead, an elderly man named Walter who'd worked the estate for 30 years, and within a week the greenhouse had glass you could see through again, weeded beds, and the beginnings of a herb garden. It was Salvatore who found her there most often. He told himself he came to inspect the grounds. Enzo told him, entirely too casually, that he inspected the grounds the way most men inspect a woman they're pretending not to like. The morning that actually changed something, he hadn't come looking for her at all. He'd walked out to the greenhouse before dawn, unable to sleep, and found Clara already there in the grey half-light, kneeling in the far bed with a photograph propped against a watering can, an old, sun-faded snapshot Walter had dug out of a drawer for her, of Elena Conti, standing beside a row of pale climbing roses that no longer existed anywhere on the estate. Clara was working a cutting into the soil with the same careful patience she gave everything, trying to match a variety she'd had to special order from a nursery 2 states away after Walter described the color from memory as best he could. Walter said, "Your mother spent 3 summers trying to get these to take," Clara said, not turning around, aware of him the way she'd become aware of most things in that house. He said she never managed it before she got sick. "I thought someone should finish it." Salvatore stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at a rose bed that had been empty his entire adult life, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing in 11 years of careful control that had prepared him for the particular ache of watching a stranger try to finish something his mother had died still reaching for. It was, though he wouldn't have named it that morning, the moment curiosity about his wife stopped being merely curiosity. When a young guard named Marco started stopping by after his shift to help water things, laughing too easily at whatever Clara said while they worked, Salvatore found reason to personally review the greenhouse's irrigation system for the better part of an hour, standing squarely between them. "The pipes are fine," Enzo told him afterward, deadpan. "I checked. Twice. I'm being thorough." When a delivery driver flirted with Clara at the front gate the following week, Salvatore reviewed the household's supplier contracts the next morning and switched flower vendors entirely, a decision he justified with 3 paragraphs about cost efficiency that Enzo read aloud in the most unconvinced voice he could manage. "You're doing it again," Clara told him, when he appeared at the greenhouse door with no plausible excuse whatsoever for the 3rd time that week. "Doing what? Finding reasons to be wherever I am." She didn't look up from the cutting she was trimming. "I hear you fired an entire produce supplier over a conversation about tomatoes at the farmer's market." Salvatore said nothing, which she had learned was the closest he ever came to admitting he'd been caught. And Clara laughed, a real laugh, the kind that startled even her, and the kind that made something in his chest loosen a fraction of an inch every time he heard it. The weeks that followed rearranged the household in ways nobody could quite point to directly. The night guards started eating together instead of alone. Clara had a habit of leaving something warm out for whoever worked overnight, and within a month the kitchen kept a pot going without being asked. The head housekeeper, a stern woman named Rosa, started lingering by the greenhouse door some evenings, until one night she admitted her own mother had kept a garden, just like it before the family lost their farm, and that watching Clara work in it felt like being handed something back she'd stopped letting herself miss. Even Tommy, prickly and homesick, started tagging along most afternoons, where Walter taught him to graft rose stems, and Marco taught him, badly, to play poker. The Massimo and Elena Conti memorial dinner fell 3 weeks later, and Livia used the occasion to host a formal gathering, inviting half of Havenport's old families under the guise of remembrance. Clara understood, the moment she walked into the dining room, that she'd been invited as a spectacle, not a guest. Livia waited until the second course to strike. "I do think it's remarkable," she said, loudly enough for the whole table to quiet. "How quickly some people learn to make themselves comfortable in a house that was never meant to welcome them." Considering everything her family took from this one, the table went very still, silverware suspended mid-air, half the guests suddenly very interested in their wine glasses. Clara set down her fork with the same careful precision she'd used on her shears the day Salvatore first walked into her shop. "My father spent 11 years insisting he didn't start that fire," Clara said, her voice steady. "Nobody believed him, but I'd ask you not to mistake my quiet for shame. I have none left to spend." "How convenient," Livia said, "for the daughter of a murderer to have run out of shame. Enough." Salvatore rose and crossed the room to stand beside Clara's chair. "My aunt speaks with more grief than judgment tonight. I'll ask the table to remember that grief does not excuse cruelty." Down the table, Dominic Russo had gone very pale, his wineglass frozen halfway to his mouth, and Clara noticed it even through the ringing in her own ears. It was 2 nights after that dinner that Clara found the box. It had been shoved beneath a potting bench in the greenhouse, half buried under decades of dead leaves. Easy to miss, unless you were on your hands and knees the way Clara had taken to being most afternoons. An old tin seed box, its paint long since faded to a color she couldn't name. She almost left it where it was. Something about the weight of it when she finally lifted it, heavier than an empty tin had any right to be, made her sit back on her heels and open it anyway. Walter, when she showed it to him, went very quiet. "That belonged to Salvatore's mother," he said. "Elena. She used to come out here after the fire before she got sick. Said the account numbers on some old shipping paper didn't sit right with her, didn't match what Bellweather's own business used to file. She tried to tell Massimo once. He was too angry with grief to listen to anything that complicated who he was allowed to blame." Walter looked at the tin. "She never trusted anyone in this house enough to hand it over properly. I think she meant to finish looking into it herself. She just ran out of time." "You knew all this," Clara said carefully, "and never told Salvatore." "I never saw the paper myself. Elena only ever spoke of it in pieces, and I assumed, once she'd passed, that she'd already given it to Massimo before she got too sick to finish anything." Walter's jaw worked once. "By the time I understood she hadn't, this greenhouse was locked. Russo had taken over every old record in the house, and a groundskeeper asking questions about 11-year-old paperwork tends to find himself looking for new work fast in a house like this one. I'm not proud of staying quiet. I'm telling you now because you're the first person who's asked the right question." Inside, alongside brittle seed packets, Clara found a stack of pressed flowers, each one flattened between torn pages of an old ledger. She lifted one gently and stopped. The page beneath it was scorched along one edge, a column of shipping account numbers, still legible in careful handwriting, and at the bottom, half-burned but readable, a signature. D. Russo. She recognized that account number. The routing digits at the front were identical to the ones printed on every quarterly receipt Russo had ever handed her across a shop counter. The same bank, the same parent account. Only the final 2 digits differed. The kind of difference that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't spent 6 years balancing her own books down to the penny, and everything to someone who had. It was the difference between a legitimate collection account and a private sub-account routed somewhere else entirely. She wrapped the fragment in a clean handkerchief and hid it in the bottom of her sewing basket, and said nothing yet. Not until she understood the whole shape of it. The tin went missing 11 days later. Tommy found her searching the greenhouse floor on her hands and knees. "I saw Mr. Russo out here last night," he said carefully. "Really late. He had a flashlight, and he wasn't wearing his usual suit. He looked nervous. He didn't see me." That night, once the house had gone quiet, Clara let herself into the small archive room Russo had twice discouraged her from visiting, using a spare key Walter had mentioned was hung on a nail in the garden shed. The room smelled of old paper and dust, lit only by a desk lamp turned low enough that no light would show under the door. Twice she froze at footsteps in the hallway outside, her pulse loud in her own ears, before they passed without stopping. It took her most of the night, layer after layer of misfilled property records, before she found what she was looking for, the original insurance claim, and beneath it, a bill of sale for the burned warehouse itself, purchased 8 months after the fire, for almost nothing, by a shell company she'd never heard of. Its ownership traced, on paper, through 2 more shell companies before it dead-ended, deliberately, in a filing cabinet marked miscellaneous. She was copying the account details by hand when she heard the door. Clara froze behind a bank of file cabinets, heart hammering, as Dominic Russo let himself in and crossed to the same drawer she'd just closed. He didn't notice it had been disturbed. He pulled out his phone instead, voice low and urgent. "It's Harrow Point Holdings, the same as before, nothing's changed." A pause. "No, she hasn't found anything. She's been distracted with that greenhouse." Another pause, longer, his voice dropping further. "I'll deal with it if I have to. I've kept this buried for 11 years. I'm not letting a florist unbury it now." He left without checking behind the cabinets. Clara didn't move for a full 5 minutes afterward. The shell company's real name, Harrow Point Holdings, now committed to memory alongside everything else, her hands still shaking as she finally slipped back to her room before sunrise. She found Salvatore alone in his study the next evening. "I need to show you something," she said, and set the handwritten copy on his desk, the scorched fragment beside it, unwrapped now, resting on the handkerchief like evidence at a trial. "The account Russo used to collect our payments doesn't match anything my father's business ever held. It matches a shell company called Harrow Point Holdings that bought the burned warehouse 8 months after the fire. I heard him say the name myself last night, in the archive. He knows I'm close," he said. "He's kept this buried for 11 years and isn't letting a florist unbury it." Salvatore read the page twice, his jaw tight. "Where did the fragment come from? Your mother's seed box?" "Walter says she found it herself, after the fire, and never trusted anyone here enough to hand it over before she died." Salvatore sat with that a long moment, something closer to grief than triumph moving across his face. He called Enzo in immediately, and the 2 of them worked through the night at the study desk, coffee going cold between them. Court filings and broker records spread across every surface, 3 layers of shell ownership, each one requiring a different clerk woken up, a different favor called in. Before the full shape of it was finally confirmed, shortly after dawn, the study windows gone grey with early light neither of them had noticed arrive. "Harrow Point traces to a numbered account," Enzo said, laying the final documents on the desk, exhausted and grim. "The numbered account traces to Russo's cousin's brokerage. He set the fire himself to collect the insurance and clear a warehouse he wanted cheap. And he spent 11 years managing the very debt file that let him watch, quarter after quarter, to make sure nobody looked closely enough to notice." Dominic Russo was summoned to the estate that morning, under the pretense of a routine review. He settled into the chair across from Salvatore's desk, with the same practiced calm he'd worn for 11 years, the same calm that had let him sit in this house every quarter and watch a lie he'd built with his own hands. Go on quietly collecting interest. "You wanted to discuss the shipping ledgers," he said. "I can have updated reports by Friday. Explain the signature." Salvatore laid the fragment down first, then Clara's handwritten page, then the bill of sale. Russo studied it, unhurried. "That's not my signature. Anyone can forge initials on a burned scrap of paper." His eyes flicked to Clara. "I'd be careful accusing a man of arson based on evidence a grieving woman happened to find conveniently in a box that happened to belong to your mother. The routing numbers on that page are identical to the ones on every receipt you handed me for 6 years, Clara said. "Same bank, same parent account. Only the final 2 digits change. The difference between the Conti collection account and a private sub-account registered through Harrow Point. I balanced my own books against that number more times than you can imagine." "Coincidence," Russo said smoothly. Or perhaps your father used a similar account before his business collapsed. It wouldn't be the first time Arthur Bellweather's paperwork didn't add up. My father's paperwork was clean for 30 years, Clara said. Yours is the one that needed 3 shell companies to hide behind. Your father was drowning in debt long before that fire, Russo said, an edge finally creeping into his voice. Everyone in Havenport knew it. Maybe he set it himself for the insurance money and simply wasn't clever enough to get away with it. Or maybe whoever really set it was clever enough to let your father take the blame instead. Have you considered that the man you're defending might be the one who actually planned this? My father died broke, in a rented room, still telling anyone who'd listen that he was innocent, Clara said quietly. A guilty man collects the insurance and disappears somewhere warm. An innocent one spends his last years trying to convince people who've already decided not to believe him. I watched him do that until it killed him. I know which one he was. Russo's composure held a moment longer, and then, without meaning to, he made a mistake. Elena should have destroyed that page the day she found it, he said, gesturing dismissively at the fragment, his voice thinning with something closer to old resentment than confidence. It would have saved everyone a great deal of trouble. Clara went very still. I never told you Elena found it. The silence that followed lasted a long time. Russo's shoulders finally collapsed, and he confessed the rest without further argument. The fire deliberately set to force an insurance payout. The warehouse purchased quietly once its value had been driven to nothing, 11 years spent managing the very debt file that let him keep watching. Russo lit the fire, Enzo said afterward. Once Russo had been taken into custody. But this family kept it burning for 11 years by never once asking a question we didn't want the answer to. Salvatore didn't call the household together right away. First, he sat alone with Clara in the study and set 3 things on the desk. A cleared title to Bellweather Blooms, free of every debt her family had ever owed. A certified transfer returning, with 11 years of interest, every payment she and her father had ever made. And a single unsigned annulment, already drafted, needing only her signature. You entered this because I left you no choice, he said quietly. I threatened your brother's future to force his sister into a marriage I called justice. It wasn't justice. It was cruelty wearing my father's grief as an excuse. I'm sorry, Clara. Not sorry that we married. Sorry for how. He pushed the annulment an inch closer. You'll remain my wife only if the choice is finally, completely yours. And I'd rather you make that choice somewhere that isn't still inside my house. Clara looked at the papers for a long time. Then she picked up the annulment, folded it without signing it, and put it in her coat pocket. I'll call the families together this week, Salvatore said. Set the record straight in front of everyone who watched you walk into this house as an accusation. I can wait until you're ready to be there for it. If you want to be, I don't. Clara stood, gathering her coat. My father's name doesn't need me standing in a room to become true again. Say what's true whether I'm there to hear it or not. That's the whole point. She met his eyes. I'm going home, to my own shop, my own bed for a while. Not because I'm angry, because I want to know who I am when nobody's collecting a debt from me. Don't come looking for reasons to check on the irrigation system. She left the estate the next morning. Salvatore kept his word. For 3 weeks, Clara ran Bellweather Blooms exactly as she always had, Tommy back at the counter with his homework, the photograph of their father still on the back wall, restored, now, to its proper meaning. Enzo delivered the paperwork on the debt and the property transfer without Salvatore's presence attached to any of it. No driver waited outside. No flowers arrived. The silence, Clara found, was its own kind of answer, and she let herself sit inside it, without hurrying toward anything. She spent those weeks doing ordinary things she hadn't let herself do in years. Closing the shop early on a slow Tuesday, just because she wanted to. Letting Tommy talk her into a movie instead of inventory. Standing in her own kitchen at midnight, deciding entirely on her own that she missed the smell of tomato leaves on someone else's hands. She didn't call the estate. She told herself, more than once, that she wasn't waiting for anything. Mostly, She believed it. Salvatore spent those same 3 weeks learning a kind of restraint he'd never once needed in his life. He caught himself twice reaching for his phone before deciding, both times, not to call. When Enzo asked on the 9th day whether he intended to visit Havenport at all, Salvatore said only that a woman who'd just been handed her freedom back deserved to use it without him standing in the doorway of it. And Enzo, who had watched him fire an entire produce supplier over a farmer's market conversation, had the good sense not to argue. You could send flowers, Enzo offered once, mostly to see what he'd say. She owns a flower shop. You could send something else then. I already tried buying my way into things that mattered to her once, Salvatore said. I'm not doing it again. The gathering Salvatore called that same week, the one that finally set the record straight in front of Havenport's old families, happened after Clara had already gone home, exactly as she'd told him to let it. She heard about most of it secondhand from Rosa, who called to tell her. 11 years ago, my father died believing Arthur Bellweather destroyed our shipment, Salvatore had told the room. I built a decade of certainty on that belief, and a marriage on top of it. I was wrong. Dominic Rousseau set that fire, and he let an innocent family absorb 11 years of shame that should have been his alone. The evidence that ends this wasn't found by my security team. It was found by my wife in an archive Rousseau spent weeks trying to keep her away from, because he understood before any of us did exactly how dangerous her attention was. Livia's voice, when it came, had been quieter than anyone at that table had ever heard it. I hated Arthur Bellweather, she said, because hating him was easier than admitting my brother died believing a lie nobody bothered to question. That isn't an excuse. Arthur Bellweather was innocent. It had cost her visibly to say it, Rosa told Clara, and nobody in that room had rushed her past the silence that followed. Clara went back to the estate herself, once before the 3 weeks were up, not to see Salvatore, but because Rosa had asked her to help arrange flowers for a memorial marker the family was finally allowed to place with her father's real name on it, cleared at last of the word that had followed him into a rented room and stayed there after he died. Livia was in the garden when Clara arrived. Neither of them said very much. But when Clara finished laying the last of the white lilies, Livia stood beside her for a moment, looking at the marker, and said only, "He should have had this 11 years ago," in a voice that carried no grievance in it at all. And Clara understood that whatever else stood between them, that much, at least, was finally settled. It was 3 weeks and 2 days after Clara left the estate that the bell over Bellweather Blooms rang at closing time, and Salvatore Conti walked in alone, no driver waiting outside, no bodyguards, carrying nothing at all. "You're empty-handed," Clara said. "That's new. I've learned that showing up with something to offer usually means I'm trying to buy an answer instead of asking for one." He stood there, unusually still for a man who commanded rooms without trying. "With no debt between us, no threat, and every door genuinely open to you, will you choose a life with me? Not the wife I was owed, the one I'd like to ask properly, if you'll let me." Clara set down her shears. "Yes," she said. "This time because I choose it." Months later, the greenhouse at the Conti estate no longer needed anyone's permission to stay open. Walter had a full-time assistant in Tommy, who had taken to grafting roses with an enthusiasm that suggested he might inherit his sister's gift for growing things. "You know he's going to ask you to marry him again properly at some point," Tommy told Clara one afternoon, not looking up from the rose stem he was learning to graft. "Like, with an actual ring this time and everything. He hasn't mentioned it. He bought a ring 3 weeks ago. Marco told me. He's just apparently very bad at figuring out when." Tommy grinned, 16, and entirely too pleased with himself. "Dad would have thought this whole thing was ridiculous, by the way. The mafia husband, the greenhouse, all of it. Would he have liked it, though?" Tommy considered that honestly, the way he considered most things now. "Yeah. He always said flowers didn't care whose name you carried. I think he'd have liked that you found a place that finally agreed with him." Clara split her weeks between the estate and her own shop after that, and nobody in either place found it strange anymore. They're terrible, she said, one evening, inspecting one of 3 stubborn tomato plants. Salvatore had insisted on growing despite every piece of advice to the contrary. I know, he said, and there was nothing cold left in his voice at all. It felt important to grow them anyway. He was quiet for a moment, turning a seedling pot slowly between his hands. My father used to say revenge was the only inheritance he had left to give me. I believed him for 11 years. It never once occurred to me that he might have simply been a grieving man who needed somewhere to put his anger, and that I didn't have to keep carrying it just because he handed it to me. What do you believe now? That the only thing worth inheriting from him was the greenhouse his wife loved enough to grow terrible tomatoes in. He looked at her, nothing calculated left in his expression at all, and possibly bad judgment about produce suppliers. Clara laughed, and when he reached over and brushed a smear of dirt from her cheek, she let him. If this story warmed your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes the truth always finds its way home. And tell us in the comments, if you were Clara, would you have gone home for those 3 weeks, or stayed to see if he'd choose you sooner? Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.